Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to address an issue that's kind of been pushed into the background by virtue of a series of events that has, quite understandably, captured all of our attention. The atrocities committed by ISIS have justified a focus of attention on how we can make America more secure from this very, very frightening and dangerous threat. But, Mr. President, we shouldn't lose sight of an ongoing threat that is simultaneously developing, and I'm referring to the Iran nuclear deal and the really disturbing developments that have occurred just in the short period of time since the JCPOA, the agreement between the Western powers, including the United States and Iran, since it was announced. So this is a deal that, in its own right, is very, very disturbing. I found it impossible to defend. But since then, it's gotten worse. And additional developments, in my view, clearly indicate that we don't really have an agreement here, and the President should not be lifting sanctions in a few weeks, which my fear is that that is exactly what the President intends to do. Let me walk through several of the items that have occurred recently that are particularly disturbing. First of all, almost immediately after the deal was announced, the Iranians the Iranian leadership insisted that they would essentially rewrite some very important parts of the deal. Specifically, they demanded that the sanctions had to be permanently lifted rather than suspended indefinitely. Now, the JCPOA language says the U.S. will, and I quote, cease the application of sanctions, end quote. Now, the administration has been very clear. They've told us that that means the sanctions are suspended, but the framework remains in place in case they need to be reapplied. And they have predicated the entire viability of this agreement on the ability to reimpose sanctions. So that's really essential that they, in fact, be available to be reapplied. But the Iranians have said, no, absolutely not. That's not what the agreement says. It says these sanctions are to be lifted and permanently removed, and they cannot be restored for any reason under any circumstances. Well, which is it, Mr. President? The Iranians clearly have indicated that they have a very different understanding than our administration does. And this matters because whether or not sanctions can be reimposed in the event of a violation is absolutely central to the enforcement of this agreement. That's according to the administration. Item number 2. Shortly after the deal was announced, a couple of our colleagues, a House member and a senator, discovered the existence of 2 secret side deals. They discovered that on a trip to Europe. They discovered that these agreements were negotiated between the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, charged with much of the enforcement of this agreement, negotiated between the IAEA and the government in Tehran. And it went to the heart of the past nuclear weapons activity that the Iranian government was involved in. The administration didn't tell us about these side agreements. The administration didn't give us these side agreements, but turns out they exist. Well, Mr. President, the Nuclear Review Act stated very clearly that the President was obligated to give us all related documentation, all of it. The actual language is, and I quote, any additional materials related thereto, including annexes, appendices, codicils, side agreements, implementing materials, documents, and guidance, end quote. I think it's abundantly clear that the legislation actually, in fact, says, and intended to say, that everything in any way related to this agreement had to be handed over to Congress. Never happened. Never got it. To this day, we haven't gotten it. In fact, no member of Congress has seen these agreements, these 2 documents. But it's not just that no member of Congress has seen them, Mr. President. Nobody in the administration has seen them, because the administration thought it was okay to just trust some other entity to negotiate a very central enforcement provision of this agreement without ever being able to even see it. It's unbelievable. So, number one, the president's in violation of the law if he lifts these sanctions, because the law states clearly that process can't begin until we've gotten all the documents. We still haven't. And a very, very important aspect of the enforcement of this agreement is something the administration has never seen. Item number 3, October 3rd, just a few weeks ago, Iran launched a new long-range precision-guided ballistic missile. Now, even the Obama administration acknowledges this is a violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1929 that prohibits any ballistic missile activities on the part of Iran. And let me quote briefly from that resolution. It's a resolution that, by the way, supports the JCPOA. It is an integral part of the nuclear deal with Iran. And it states, Iran is, quote, not to undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons, including launches using such ballistic missile technology until the date 8 years after the JCPOA. But the intermediate range ballistic missiles that the Iranians launched absolutely could hold nuclear weapons. They have a 1,000-mile range. They could reach Israel. And then a few weeks after that, on November 21st, Iran launched a second ballistic missile. Despite everybody pointing out that they were in violation of the JCPOA with the first launch, they demonstrated just how concerned they were about that by a second launch. Slightly different system, quicker setup time, more mobility, more maneuverable, still capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Why does this matter, Mr. President? Well, it matters because it demonstrates Iran has every intention to continue to improve its ability to deliver nuclear weapons great distances with great precision. It demonstrates a continued intent on Iran to develop the capability to threaten and attack Israel and U.S. allies. It is a fact that with this technology in place, if and when they violate this agreement and develop nuclear weapons, or even if they just wait till it's over and then develop nuclear weapons, which the agreement permits, they will immediately be prepared to launch these weapons great distances. But maybe most fundamentally, Mr. President, Iran is in open violation of the JCPOA. They obviously have contempt for this agreement. How can we trust them when they are blatantly, flagrantly violating central parts of it? Item number 4, October 29, Iran sends weapons to the Assad regime on Russian cargo planes in violation of another UN Security Council resolution. Now, this was part of a bigger deal. It included, in the negotiation of the deal, Commander Soleimani traveled to Russia. This is in violation of UN Security Council resolutions because travel ban had been imposed on him personally. That didn't matter. He went to Russia and negotiated an agreement that included weapons for Assad in violation of another UN Security Council resolution and Russian delivery of the SA-300 air defense system for Iran. Now, why is this important, Mr. President? Well, yet another flagrant violation of international law and UN Security Council resolutions, but also because the delivery of these surface-to-air missiles diminishes the ability and the credibility of a military strike against Iran, which we have been told is always the ultimate backstop. Well, you'd think maybe the administration would have some concern about this. October 29th, item number 5 on my list here. Iran arrests an American and convicts another American. The Iranian regime arrested the Iranian-American businessman Siamek Namazi. He was guilty of promoting improved ties between Iran and the United States, so he was arrested. and convicted the Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian in a show trial. This American reporter has now been held for over 500 days. Meanwhile, of course, the Iranian hardliners continue to hold their anti-American rallies, burn American flags, shout death to America. Why does all this matter, Mr. President? This is not contemplated by the JCPOA directly, after all. Well, it matters because it reveals the ongoing open hostility of the Iranian leadership to the United States. In response, of course, America has taken no steps, no action, but fundamentally it's clear that this deal has not changed the mindset or the attitude of the regime to America, and now it appears that Iran is holding some additional chips, if you will, in the form of American hostages, and that should be pretty disturbing. Item number 6, December 2nd, just a few days ago, the IAEA report comes out on the previous military dimensions of Iran's weapons program. What did they conclude? They concluded that up until and through at least 2009, Iran was in fact working on a nuclear weapons capability. That's the IAEA's report. That's not my opinion. That's their conclusion. They confirmed, among other things, that the Iranians were working on neutron triggers for detonation purposes, miniaturization efforts for warheads so that they could be put on ballistic missiles, and specific designs for fitting them on weapons. In addition to confirming the nuclear weapons activity of the Iranian regime, the IAEA report highlighted that the Iranians were not fully cooperating as they were trying to determine the extent of the past military dimensions. Again, according to the IAEA, the Iranians consistently tried to mislead investigators. At the Parchin site, where much of the research and weaponization process was underway, the Iranians were heavily sanitizing the site. In recent months, they were trying to destroy the evidence prior to the IAEA investigation and determination. And the Iranians did not provide all of the information that was requested of them. This is all from the IAEA. So why does all this matter? Well, first and foremost, it is absolutely indisputable proof positive that Iran has been lying through this entire process. They have always said they have no nuclear weapons program, that all of their nuclear research has always been exclusively for peaceful purposes. It's been a lie. It's always a lie. It was a lie right through the entire negotiations. If they are willing to lie about this, what else are they lying about? And since they were not willing to fully cooperate, how much do we really know about exactly how far along their weapons process was? And if and when we discover future weapons developments, we won't know exactly whether, for sure, necessarily, we might not know whether or not that was prior to the agreement or post-agreement. It just creates a great deal of dangerous ambiguity. Finally, and this to me is maybe the most shocking, November 24th, the State Department acknowledges that the government of Iran has never ratified and has not signed the JCPOA. They haven't signed the agreement. That's not me saying. This is the administration acknowledges this in a letter to a member of Congress, Congressman Pompeo, on November 19th, 2015. The State Department says, among other things, and I quote, "The JCPOA is not a treaty or an executive agreement, and it is not a signed document. The JCPOA reflects political commitments." Well, the president previously had called it a negotiated diplomatic agreement and attached great weight to it. The president said, and I quote, "The agreement now reached between the international community and Iran builds on this tradition of strong principled diplomacy. After 2 years of negotiations, we have achieved a detailed arrangement that permanently prohibits Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons." Except that it doesn't, and Iran hasn't signed it. The president even compared it to the START Treaty and the non-proliferation treaties. very, very different. The fact is, the State Department letter openly admits that this agreement, if you can call it that, is not legally binding on Iran, and the Iranians have refused to sign it. Instead, it's supposed to depend on extensive verifications. We've talked about the problems with that, and the ability to snap back sanctions, which likewise has been dramatically undermined at best. But let's look at what the Iranians have done. President Rouhani pushed the Iranian legislature specifically not to adopt the JCPOA. They've ignored it. They have not voted on it. They have not ratified it. They have not affirmed it. So in addition to not signing it, they have not had a ratification vote to approve it. In fact, they voted on some other framework. Ayatollah Khamenei has suspended further negotiations with the U.S. So they have not signed the agreement, they have not voted on the agreement, and they have announced that they have no intentions of discussing anymore with us the substance of this. Mr. President, it looks pretty clear to me that the Iranians are creating the ability to completely deny any obligation on their part to honor the terms of the agreement. It looks pretty obvious to me that that's what's going on here. And yet, we're just a few weeks away from what this agreement, that isn't really been agreed to, calls the implementation day. That's the day on which the sanctions are lifted. And by all accounts, it appears as though the administration intends to go ahead and lift the sanctions. Principally, among them, is a release of many tens of billions, maybe $100 billion to Iran. Despite the fact that the Iranians have demanded that these sanctions be permanently lifted, despite the discovery of these secret agreements, despite at least 2 ballistic missile launches in direct violation of the agreement, despite the violations of the arms embargoes, despite the arrests of Americans, despite the confirmation that we all now know that Iran has been lying throughout this entire process about the past weaponization, and despite the fact that they refuse to sign or pass this agreement. Despite all that, we apparently are just a few weeks away from lifting the sanctions, releasing upwards of $100 billion to the Iranians, and of course, at that moment, losing virtually all leverage over Iran and their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Mr. President, I think it's time that the President of the United States realize and acknowledge there is no agreement here. There's not a deal. Any reason one would think at this point that Iran is going to honor this agreement that's not really an agreement, I think is extremely naive at best. And I hope in the very short time that remains, we are able to persuade the administration to reconsider their apparent intent to lift these sanctions, reward this regime with a staggering amount of money with which they will do, in my view, very likely great harm. I yield the floor.